thank you for joining us today. Tiffany and I are going to have a conversation about race in the workplace. Tiffany, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, Suman. Great to be here with you today. I'm Tiffany Castano. I'm CEO of Sepher, and we are an HR consulting firm helping small business and nonprofit build their infrastructures, giving them that building block to be creative and successful.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. And I'm Suman. I am the CEO of Well Balanced Solutions. I help workplace leaders and teams effectively communicate and have a better work environment. So Tiffany and I connected over a networking event, and we decided that the two of us, as experts in our field, we would get together and sort of address the situation that's happening now and talk about ways that we can purposefully start having these difficult conversations around race. And so I think one of the best ways to start, Tiffany and I were trying to figure out how do we go through this process, and conversations start with questions. And I think it's really important that people understand that nothing has changed. Questions, so long as they come from a genuine place and a genuine curiosity, are a great way to start conversations. So I'm actually going to just start with asking Tiffany a question. One of the questions that comes to me quite often is, what is a microaggression? So I think that's a really good way for us to start having this conversation, is to just talk a little bit about what that is and give examples of it.
Yeah, I think, I absolutely agree. And it's okay to start with a question. Most of our conversations when you walk up to someone is, what do you do? What's your name? And we're genuinely curious. And so to your point, that's where we want to start. So a lot of people are not familiar with the term microaggressions, but really what it is it can be subtle, it can be blatant. I kind of describe them sometimes as those little jabs or pokes, whether they're unintentional or intentional kind of slights, if you will. So it might be, oh, you speak so articulately. I've heard that so many times to me, and it can place someone in an uncomfortable position. Like, well, what did you mean by that? I'm a Black female. Would you say that to my white male counterpart, that he speaks articulately? And quite candidly, I don't see that being the case most of the time. So it's those little things that could offend. I've had them be more blatant. Sometimes it's people saying, where are you from? Or where do you come from? Implying that you're not from a certain region or something. So little things like that. Whether you intend them to come off that way or not, it's being mindful of those things, because they do get stored in people's mental filing cabinets, as someone once said to me.
And you're absolutely right. I've had those questions asked of me as well. With my name, people have asked, oh, so where are you from? And I always answer, well, I grew up in New York. And they're like, no, where are you from? And, again, that implies that we're not part of this country, which is not true. And then you've got, things like, oh, you don't have an accent. That's not how I expected an Indian person to speak. So exact same things that you're talking about is that people need to be mindful when they're having these conversations, that just because it's those stereotypes and those things that we should not be working and dwelling on, especially in any facet of our life.
Right. It gives, because what that does on the other side is it says to that person, you don't belong, you're different, you're not a part of my circle. And that's not inclusive behavior. And so those are not, certainly in the workplace and just in life, those are not things that we should be doing and participating.
Exactly. And then the other one that I get all the time is unconscious bias. I think that's a really big one as well, that we should talk just a few minutes about.
That is, and I will put the disclaimer out there that my DEI friends are the subject matter experts, but I know enough about this to be able to speak somewhat to it. And that, again, I mentioned mental filing cabinets. And so we all have within us, whether we want to admit it or not, bias. It could be gender bias. It could be racial bias, a religious bias. We have lots of those. And so you would be surprised sometimes the things that you have a bias against, or the people whom you may have a bias against. So it's essentially those prejudices, or it is the difference too. Someone very well trained, a good friend of mine, her name's Tiffany too. She is in the DEI space, and she did a training, and I learned so much from her. And we talked about the difference between tolerance and acceptance. Everyone would rather be accepted, included, than tolerated. No one wants to just be tolerated. If we have a headache, we tolerate that, right? So I think that, that's a big thing, is learning to understand, being self-aware, knowing what even, some of your triggers are. Some of us, we all have our experiences and our backgrounds, and sometimes our experiences that we carry through with us, we may have triggers based on that, based on the experiences. It's judging someone based on how they look, and things that, maybe I had an experience back, some time ago, and that has formed my perceptions around things. So it's being aware of that, and it's something we can always work on. It doesn't mean that you're broken, or that there's no hope for you. It means that you're aware of it and you want to make a different choice, be conscious choice.
Right. So as an example, would you say, we've heard a lot in the news over the last several years, how schools are talking to these children about their dreadlocks in their hair, and so the sort of that the biases that are associated with dreadlocks. Would that be an example of an unconscious bias, as as the school systems are talking about it, and even sometimes career coaches talk to employees about, hey, you might want to change your hairstyle. Would you say that those are examples of unconscious biases?
I would say they could be, because depending on that individual, maybe that is some prejudice that they have within themselves, that they believe everyone with dreadlocks is. I've now created a situation or a persona around that, whether it's true or not. And so stereotypes play into that. That to me is also really a microaggression. It's you're sending a message, and you as a leader, we can get into that later too, but as leaders, we have to be the example and set the example. And if you are a coach or a teacher, or someone like us who is a CEO, and we're saying that to someone, how does that land with that person? What have we just said to them? It's saying, I don't accept you. I don't accept your hair. Some cultures, that's part of how they do that, even in American culture. And so it really just, it's just being aware, thinking before you speak, because again, there's intent and there's impact. Just because you didn't intend for something to be some way doesn't mean that's not how it landed. The impact on the other side is what matters. Not that you can't recover from that. So
great. That's a great point. It's that impact. So that's a really good point. So taking all of this stuff that we've just talked about, and moving it into the workplace environment. So here we are in a workplace environment, and you have a team of people, and these microaggressions or unconscious biases are sort of coming out. And as a team member, if I'm sitting here, of course, I want to continue to be employed, right? Because that is the bread and butter of my life. It helps me maintain my household and things of that nature. I need a job. What sort of HR legal protections are out there to an employee who has a challenge with someone on their team and they go to HR? Is it something that someone can get fired for, and sort of calling out another teammate on these sort of situations that occur? Can we talk a little bit about how HR fits into this and sort of what legal protections we have as employees?
yeah, I would love to talk about that. I love what I do. And this is so important to me. Creating safe workplaces is all wrapped into this, because right now there's a lot of unrest in the world itself, in the external world, but those things carry on with people and their families, and it comes into the workplace. You can't expect a Black employee to just leave that at the door. We tell people so much, which can be a form of microaggression, unconscious bias. We tell them, check your day at the door. You can't show your emotions. We don't allow people to come and show up as their authentic selves, and that's a shame to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have individuals who have these things going on, they may feel stuck. Hopefully they know who their HR generalist or business partner or HR contact is. If not, please start there and inform people, provided you have an HR department, because as leaders, too many times I've seen it where leaders feel like, oh, they shouldn't go to HR. Of course, I am an advocate for people trying to resolve conflict within themselves and within a team. That doesn't always work, and not everybody's always comfortable, but that's where HR can be kind of a neutral party to hear someone out and to share. EAP, employee assistance plans, programs, those are one really
Yes.
great resource. So if you're uncomfortable talking to your HR department, or you don't know who that is, or you're not comfortable talking to your leader, or your leader's not around, that is a free benefit that most employers offer. It's the amount of sessions that you get vary, but it is something that's confidential. Your company won't find out that you've called, or the reason that you called. So completely confidential, a way to get some assistance if you want to talk to someone about that. Just because you maybe had a conflict, or you're uncomfortable with someone, or you didn't like their behavior and you've now reported it, there are legal protections from that. I'm not a lawyer, I'll throw that out there too, but also there are reasons why these things exist, whether policies and programs, there are whistleblower policies, there are anti-discrimination and anti-harassment, because those things can fall into that realm. And so again, intent versus impact. You may not mean to harass somebody or discriminate against them, but if you're not aware of your unconscious bias, or you're not aware of, or you're not treating people respectfully, that can land you in a little bit of trouble. And certainly we're going to discover, what your intent was, but that's going to make a difference. And so I encourage people to leverage their HR departments,
Yeah,
and to speak up.
yep, and I agree. Sometimes people don't realize what they're doing. And so I think, if you're comfortable enough to talk to that individual who you have a challenge with, that's the best thing to do, is to let that person know, hey, what you said or how you said it made me uncomfortable, and here's the reason why. But if you're not comfortable, it's a great idea to go to your HR department. And I think those employee assistant programs are great. And a lot of people need to understand that those are available to them, or at least check with their company to make sure that they are available, and then use those resources. The companies are paying for them, and it's free for the employees, and the employees really should take advantage of those programs. Otherwise, when it's time to reassess, companies are always looking to cut back, right? So if they're not being used, then the company's going to get rid of them. So those are, I think, some really good things for us to think about. So let's now move into sort of that group setting, and the nitty gritties of how do we actually start these conversations. And so one of the things you touched upon earlier was creating that safe space in your team. And so I think one of the things that what makes a safe environment is setting guidelines. So as a team leader, I think it's important for a team leader to set those guidelines at the beginning of a meeting, or as new staff comes in, or weekly get-togethers, whatever that looks like, but setting those guidelines. And I think one of the biggest guidelines that I think is important is understanding and accepting that we are all in a different part of our journey in this situation, right? And so where we are should not be the point where we get upset at someone. Someone could be at the beginning of their journey, and the realization and that self-reflection that they're taking their time to start now. Someone could be at the middle, and someone could be nearing the end, where they are sort of understanding where they're coming from. And the biggest thing that we need to do is to understand and accept that that's where we are, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? So as the conversations happen, it's important to understand that and to be kind to others when it comes to those sorts of things, correct?
That is so, so important. Thank you for sharing that. That is gold. That so many people don't know where to start, but I think, as we said before, it's starting out with curiosity. There's no harm
Mm-hmm.
in curiosity, provided that you're respectful about it. And sometimes so many people have said to me that they don't know how to ask something, or they don't know how to start a conversation. And what holds people back a lot of times is, what if I get it wrong? What if I say the wrong thing?
Yes,
What if I unintentionally offend? Guess what? That's an opportunity to continue the conversation. And so you have to meet people where they're at. I tell employees and leaders that when I'm coaching them all the time. It is meeting people where they're at. Not everyone's on the same end of the spectrum. And so you definitely need to make sure that you're explaining that to people, and letting them, and creating a space where they can be
mm-hmm.
comfortable. If you shut that door because you are like, well, that's not true, or you need to go fact check that, or go Google something, respecting that may be how that person feels. You have to also balance that with what the needs are and where that person is at on their journey too. That's how we come together. That's how we build understanding and foster inclusive environments.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's brilliant what you said with regards to genuine curiosity, right? That's how we raise our children, right? Is to ask questions all the time, so long as it's coming from a place of love and genuine interest, not just because I want to put someone in an uncomfortable position, or not just because, well, that's expected of me. But if you're genuinely interested in learning about a different culture, what an individual is going through. I mean, even with the question, how are you? How many times have we said, oh, that didn't feel genuine? Someone just asked me how I was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even just that question, so long as it is asked genuinely and you want to know how someone is doing and are prepared to get an answer that says, I'm having a crappy day and this is
Yeah.
why, right? Because there's situations where sometimes you just gloss over, oh, I'm fine, but really you aren't. So you have to be prepared for someone to say, I feel like crap, and this is why.
Yeah.
And because you've asked that question, you've opened the door, and now you have to genuinely sit there and help that individual. But it all goes back to starting that conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I, I definitely agree with that. And sometimes, even right now, the question, how are you, can feel very loaded to some people.
Mm-hmm.
I will say personally that when people ask me how I am, I'm like, do I say that I cried last night because I'm
Right.
very sad about what's going on in the world? Do I put on the smile, as many people have to do when they come into the workplace and into a situation? Because is it acceptable for me to share how I'm truly feeling? So that's
Right.
where that space is, where we need to fill in that gap to create the space that that person does feel comfortable to say, you know what? I am having a day. Here's why. Are you open to listening to me?
Right.
Questions will always be a safer place, provided that person's ready to receive it that way. But questions are a great way to start these conversations.
Yep, absolutely right. So now, let's say we're sitting in a meeting and we sort of started having these conversations. Um, the next important thing I believe is not talking over each other. I've had situations where, again, if someone has asked me how I am doing, and if I have felt I really need to unload, and I start to unload and suddenly I'm being interrupted, that just gives the wrong, it is not creating that safe environment. It just pushes me out of that safe environment and makes me defensive because I've been asked a question and I should now be allowed to complete my thought and answer. And so I think that's a very important thing with that next step. And so as a facilitator or leader of a group, being able to let the team know interrupting is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. Even if you may be done with the conversation, the individual who's speaking is not. And even as conversations get heated, now at some point the facilitator has to step in or the team leader has to step in and say, it's getting a little heated, let's take a step back and let's regroup and let's have a more productive way of having this conversation. But at the end of the day, that interrupting is unacceptable.
Yeah. And as a leader, too many times I've seen in HR, I've been a part of a meeting where teams come together and it gets heated and
Mm-hmm.
people have differing opinions, and we should be celebrating those in the workplace. Diversity of thought is included in
Yes.
diversity and full inclusion. And that doesn't get stopped. And it just like, I've had to interject while I want to leave the power and authority with the leaders in the room who direct the work of that team. Sometimes there needs to be someone who intervenes. And I have had to say, okay, this is going on too long. This is not acceptable. It's not productive. We're not being kind to each other. You know, how do we get back to kind of neutral ground? And so as leaders, it is your job to step in and not just leave also the elephant in the room. I've had too many times where there's a herd of elephants in the room or in an organization, and that becomes part of the culture. And then you show that if that's acceptable, now that shows that, you know, your team, you don't care about them, that you avoid conflict, and so they should do the same. And now create a space where they're uncomfortable coming forward because they think it's not acceptable. And that's where in HR we see, you know, some pretty sticky situations, and frankly situations that have escalated that with just a little conversation or not ignoring the problem could have been resolved without going that far.
Exactly. And I think the other thing to follow up with that is the conversation doesn't end when the meeting ends. Right? Yeah. That has to continue. So you were talking about the herds of elephants. I've definitely been there. There have been many times where I've been almost trampled by those herds of elephants. But I think right? It's insane. But that doesn't mean all the answers and solutions are going to happen in that one sitting and in that meeting, right? You open up that gate, the herd is coming out, and you might only get to put one back in before you have to go back to work. But the idea is to come back again and to have those continuous conversations so that the conversation continues. So again, the solution's not going to happen in one sitting. It may take multiple sittings and conversations. And even when solutions do come, the conversations should never stop, because that's how we improve ourselves and how we continue to learn and build that community that we all so need and that we require as human beings. We need to feel that we are a part of a community, and it's just how humans are created. So I think that the takeaway with that is that we're not going to solve all the problems in that one meeting.
And isn't that the way, and here's the perspective that I come from too when I approach things like that. Such a great point that you brought up, Suman. I think that so many times we think we have to have the answer, and so it grips us in this fear, and we stop in place, and we are like, I can't say that to that person. What if they think, now you're assuming, also assume positive intent always, but now you're assuming that it's going to land incorrectly, or you're overthinking it, and so you never start the conversation, you never go over the line. And I think that for so many people, it's every meeting that we have, like how many times do you go to one single meeting and everything is resolved and there's a magic solution to you know what you're trying to do, a new initiative or a new program or what have you. That doesn't happen in general. And so these conversations, whether they're about race or some other type of genuine curiosity, need to continue just as any other meeting would continue. It's no different. And I think we overcomplicate things at times. And don't get me wrong, it's sticky and it's uncomfortable, and I get that. But I am coming from the perspective, and I am encouraging people to just think of it as another meeting. And any place we should approach things with genuine curiosity and wanting to come to a solution. So I think this is no different.
Yep, absolutely right. And so let's talk about what the dynamic feels like now that everyone's working from home and having these conversations on Zoom or any other video outlet. You know, when you're in the space with your team, you can tell as people are getting more upset. You know, they're wiggling, their chest is rising as they're breathing. You can see the facial expressions, even how someone might want to sit on their hands, or you can read the body language of what's happening with your teammates. So that would allow you to either step back and say, okay, I'm saying something that's sitting uncomfortably with other people on my team, or you know, maybe I need to take a step back and think about how I'm approaching this, or ask that individual how they're feeling. But now that we're all on Zoom and on these video calls, that's another added layer of complexity that we bring into the conversation. And and so it makes it very difficult. But I think at that point, I urge that the individuals who are feeling uncomfortable at that point need to raise their voices and to say, you know, that statement made me uncomfortable. Because if you sit in that uncomfortableness, that's unproductive, you're not learning anything except creating frustration and anger within yourself.
Yeah, and then it festers, and then morale erodes, and then
Mm-hmm.
leaders get uncomfortable and employees get uncomfortable. One great way is for leaders to make sure they check in with their employees, all their employees, but also creating a space on the agenda. Let's talk about what's going on right
Mm-hmm.
now. We talked about those herds of elephants. Don't just assume. I unfortunately had an experience earlier this week where I came to encounter a situation where it was, oh, well, what are we going to do, for this fun activity? And it was nothing in that whole entire meeting was acknowledged in terms of what is going on. And I thought, gosh, if I was a Black employee right now in this meeting, it to me, that would imply this is unimportant. We have not even
Right.
talked about this as a team. And just because I'm a Black employee doesn't mean that someone else, there could be a white employee who is like, wow, I really feel like now there wasn't a space for me to address. I just had someone tell me the other day from another meeting that I was in where I brought that up and brought it to the table. Thank you for doing that. I want to set aside some time to talk with you and to really understand. Had I not brought that conversation to the table, she would never have a space for that. So we have to be mindful of these things when we enter meetings, and creating even a space on the agenda is so, so important.
Exactly. And you're absolutely right. And that's a great segue to talk about some suggestions that we have with regards to creating that safe space, and examples, actually calls to actions at the end of the day is what it is. Like, so you, like you said, it's getting a space on that agenda for a check-in, and a genuine check-in, not just a gloss over of, oh, I'm fine, but creating that time to give to someone if they need it, for a genuine check-in. So if someone is having a bad day, regardless of what the situation is, but if that means that we push the entire agenda aside, well, then that's what needs to happen, right? And that all goes back to creating that safe space. And I think part of the other thing is people need to show up and be ready to have those conversations, right?
Yes.
Show up and be present. Don't think about, oh, I have to get back to the next meeting, or I need to go check my email, or what's for lunch, or anything like that. But actually, when you come to these meetings and there is a point on the agenda where it is a genuine check-in, be present. Yes. Be ready, be willing, be able to support your teammates in whatever they're going in that particular day, especially in the environment that we are in today.
Yeah, such an awesome point you just made. Absolutely, always be present.
Yep. And then some of the other call to actions that you and I talked about, I come from a place of education. I have had to answer repetitive questions over my multiple years of being alive with regards to my culture, right? Just the same questions over and over again. And some people say, well, aren't you exhausted and tired for having to answer those same questions? Honestly, I am, but I would rather answer that question than have that individual continuously walking around ignorant.
Yes.
Right? So for me, that place of education is very important. So ask questions, right? These are the call to actions. Is definitely ask the questions. Again, from a place of genuine curiosity, not to make me uncomfortable or to make someone else uncomfortable, but because you are genuinely interested in learning about a different culture or someone's experience into what's happening. So again, because of where I come from, I'm always open and ready to answer questions. And if I don't know the answers, I of course will say I don't know them, but let's learn them together. I don't want that to be the end of that conversation. And then I think one of the other things that we talked about was, how many times at the office have we come to lunchtime and everyone's like, oh, what are we going to do for lunch today? And let's order, the same sub sandwiches or the same pizzeria, right? But I mean, right? And it's come to the point where some of the places that we went to, I didn't even need to look at a menu. I'd be like, I'm a number 4, that was my order. And everyone,
no mail, please.
Exactly, right? Exactly. But I think to go along with that whole education thing, one of the really great things to think about and to do is to order from a place that you've never ordered from, that's a new cuisine for your office. and then to create a conversation about it. And it doesn't mean that you have to have an employee from that country. That's what Google is for. Is Google the end all be all? No, but it's a great place to start, right? So if you've never had Vietnamese food, or you've never had soul food, or you've never had Thai food, it's a great way to bring those different cultures in and learn about what the spices are that were involved in that, and why do they cook in a certain way because of their regions. And so I find that that's a really good thing in sort of growing people's minds and moving them outside the little box that they're used to being in.
And food brings us together. We know that.
Yes.
We've been taught that. We've experienced it, right? And I love to eat. I do
Yes.
love to eat. And if you've never had soul food, you need to eat some soul food. If you never had Vietnamese food, you need to eat that too. Thai, great. I love to sample it all, but that does, it does help you learn. And you get to eat some tasty food too. So.
Exactly. What are any other suggestions that you have that people can start taking those small steps towards sort of growing their mind and thinking outside of the box when it comes to cultures and people and diversity?
Yeah, I have a few that have come to mind, and one I feel very strongly about, and that is, we talked about Google, and I get it. People are frustrated and exhausted, and they want to say, just go Google it or look that up. But does that really bring us to a place of having the ability to have an open conversation? I would argue, no, it doesn't. So not shutting people down or saying, you don't know my struggle, you don't know what it's like to sit in my skin. People don't, right? But you've now closed the door to that conversation. That may be the one and only time that they're willing, and now they're going to become uncomfortable because you shut them down. Be open. Just always be open and respect curiosity. Now, if someone's calling you a racial slur or something, I would say that's not very kind, and I would block that conversation. But when people are genuinely asking because they don't sit in your skin, they don't understand what it's like, be open. I would also say your local libraries. I learned this from my friend Renee. She she calls herself a nerd, a library nerd, and I'm grateful.
I'm a part of that group.
Me too. I grew up in libraries. My mom was like, go to the library and then you can ride your bike.
Yes.
And so I support my local library as well, and it's so important. There are lots of books. If you don't know where to start, your librarian can help you. A lot of the neighborhoods have the little local neighborhood libraries, so you can check those out. Ask a DEI expert, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can ask an HR person, ask your leader, but start somewhere and try to find out. You can even Google. Maybe that's the place you start. Many companies also have employee resource groups, or what we call ERGs. They were our former affinity groups. And so those are great places too. There's typically one for women, for Black people, for Latinos, and so there's all different, and we're seeing those grow for LGBTQ community. We see a lot of these groups based on the wonderful diversity that we have in our workplaces, just all of that being celebrated. And so giving work time to those, that's another way to be very inclusive. And so those are great resources for you to connect or partner for each group to collaborate too. And just because you're a woman, that you don't allow men into your certain employee resource group. So you want to be open and inclusive in that way too. So those are a few of the things that are kind of burning on my mind before we leave here.
Yeah. No, and those are great suggestions, absolutely. And then to piggyback a little bit on the library, how many of us belong to book clubs? I think it's a great thing to then take those books and have the conversation, even if you don't have an individual, again, from that background, but it's a matter of delving deeper and trying to understand what that character was going through, creating that level of empathy, learning about the struggles of a character in a book. It could be even a historical fiction book. There's so much out there that talks about this, and really some great writers who will give you the insight of what happens in their cultural groups. So having the conversations within your book clubs, I think, is a great way also to sort of move that conversation.
Definitely.
Yeah. Great. So I think we've had a great conversation today. At least we've started that conversation. I encourage everyone to reach out to Tiffany and or me. We'd love to continue the conversation. Our goal is to create some type of a series and to come back. One of the things in the near future we want to do is to have a Q&A session that builds off of the conversation that we've had today. So if you do have any questions, please email us or put them in the comment section to where you found the link to this video. We will definitely address those questions, and we want to continue having this conversation. So you will see Tiffany and I back here again in the very near future.
Yes, you will. Yes, you will. And we hope that you, in the interim, start your own conversations. And again, as Suman said, if you don't know how to start it, reach out to one of us. Drop us a note in the comments, and we will definitely be able to and willing to help you out there.
Sounds great. Thanks, Tiffany. I love our time together always.
Likewise. Take care. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.